This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 713, entitled Why the FIPping of Women is Critical for Masculists. Description. The FIPping of women is seen as being critical for Masculists, since many of men's gender issues would be solved by living in a FIP society, where women are FIPped. In brackets, FIP, F-I-P, equals financially independent person. This longish two-part flyer spells out in some detail why Masculists think this. Fire itself. Why the FIPping of women is critical for Masculists, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer spells out why Masculists see the FIPping of women as critical for achieving the main Masculist goals for the liberation of men. It presents the main and very strong arguments of the Masculists that society needs to listen to, or we wipe ourselves out. I begin with the status quo in gender political terms, and show how toxic they are for men. In the 70s, the feminists took over the divorce courts, bringing with them their traditional expectations they had towards men, that is, seeing men as the breadwinners for the family. So when a divorce occurred, it was unconsciously assumed by these feminist divorce court lawyers and judges that the man would simply continue his role of paying for the family. Over the decades, this assumption made it easy for divorcing mothers to get a very favourable divorce deal from her ex-husband, in the sense of getting custody of the kids in about 90% of cases, in 2/3 of states in the US, and many Western countries. She got half his wealth and goods. He was forced to make child payments to his kids, whom he was barely allowed to see, perhaps twice a month on weekends. He lost his house so that his ex-wife could raise her kids in it. And if his ex-wife was a real fluffy, brackets, fluffy equals a masculine term for a traditional woman who expects to live off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life, thus manslaving him for decades, the worst of all gender crimes as seen by the Masculists, close brackets. He was often forced to pay her alimony until he died, with no legal nor moral obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and FIP up, in brackets, FIP, F-I-P, equals a Masculist term for financially independent person, by getting a career competent education that would make her a FIP, and thus not manslave and divorce rape a man, one father in 4, close brackets. It's this horrific statistic of one father in 4 getting butchered in the hated, fluffy feminist-dominated divorce court system that is indirectly wiping out whole populations. In many Western countries, the divorce rate is now about 70%, and 70% of those divorces are initiated by women. If the divorcing mothers are university graduates, that figure rises to 90% of divorces are initiated by women. Thanks to the manosphere, that is, men on the internet talking about men's issues, men's lib, most young men nowadays are aware how toxic marriage is for men, and have learned how toxic the feminist-controlled divorce court system has become for divorcing fathers, who face a 1 chance in 4 of having their lives ruined. So not surprising, the majority of young men now in the US and comparable Western countries have learned not to marry, not to have kids, and spend their money on themselves. That is, they have chosen to live the MGTOW, MGTOW lifestyle, in brackets, MGTOW, MGTOW equals men going their own way, who refuse to be abused by women in this way, spending their time and money on themselves, liberating themselves from being man-slaves and being divorce-raped by women, who have traditional expectations of men, that who see men as cash machines, who work for women for decades of their lives. Close brackets. The core idea of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being man-slaves to women, working for women for decades of a man's life, with no moral nor legal obligation on women to FIP up, so that they are not fluffies as adults, who expect to deeply oppress men by manslaving and divorce-raping them. Masculists place tremendous moral pressure on women to get off their fat parasitic asses and FIP up, based on the following very powerful moral argument. It was men who gave women science-based medicine, resulting in women today having a life expectancy of 85 years. It was men who gave women the contraceptive pill, household gadgets, higher education, etc., so that women today have a career window of half a century. So Masculists stand up, pointing the finger at women and telling them in very forceful, moralistic terms, now that you women can work, you must work. Anything else is man's slavery, and man's slavery will get you killed. Masculists are abolitionists, seeing man's slavery as slavery, and hence hated, and a war issue. Masculists are at war against fluffies and fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges. Masculists see man's slavery as literally 1,000 times worse than was Negro slavery, given the numbers. There were several million Negro slaves in the early 1800s in the US, and there are today several billion man slaves in the world today. One of the major goals of the Masculists is to rid the world of man's slavery by ridding the world of fluffies, by wiping them out, forcing them to FIP up or die, by being made manless, by being totally ignored by men, not even pumped and dumped, forced to rot on the shelf, dying slow, miserable deaths. Masculists expect women to also be snurfs, that's S-N-U-R-F. That is slim, nurturative and FIP, so that women are sexually attractive to look at, are emotionally pleasing to be with, and who don't manslave and divorce rape men by being fluffies. Masculists have a very effective strategy to force women to FIP up, and that is, if women don't become FIPs, then they get totally ignored by men, masculisted men, who in time will be most men, as Masculist and MGTOW ideas spread across the planet, influencing billions of men. A fluffy can only be a fluffy if she can get her financial claws into some stupid, ignorant, gullible, man-slavable man. Unfortunately for fluffies, the supply of such men is drying up due to the influence of the internet and the manosphere, which is preaching to men against the toxicities of traditional marriage, which sees men only as cash machines, quoting women,
who exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies.
Unquote. As most men become masculisted, that is, having absorbed masculist ideas, attitudes and expectations, the lives of fluffies will be made increasingly miserable as men learn to spit in their faces, hurling hateful abuse at them for being manslaving, divorce-raping vermin, to be exterminated by very angry, verbally vicious, ideologically hateful masculists, whose aim is to wipe out fluffies by forcing them to FIP up or to die a slow, miserable death, rotting on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, utterly rejected by men, masculisted men, both socially and sexually. A few years from now, as the Masculist and MGTOW messages continue to spread, young women will be feeling tremendous moral pressure on them to FIP up, to drop their fluffy expectations, or to suffer horrific rejection by men, which will destroy their lives and personalities, driving millions of young women, young fluffies, to suicide, being forced into manlessness and total social and sexual rejection by men, that is, into a horrible, slow, miserable death. For the past 6 decades, the feminists have had pretty much an ideological monopoly over gender politics. As a result, millions of young women have been powerfully brainwashed by feminist ideas that gender oppression is a one-way street, which is the main idea of feminism, that is, that women are the oppressed and men are the oppressors. This idea is so widely spread across the Western world that millions of young women have rather misandrous attitudes towards men, taught them by monoconscious feminists. In brackets, monoconscious equals a Masculist term meaning believing that gender oppression is a one-way street, that is, men oppress women. Close brackets. Young women therefore feel fully justified in being surly towards young men, seeing young men as oppressors of women, who rape women, sexually harass women, are domestically violent towards women, who are part of the patriarchy, who are misogynistic towards women, etc. This misandrous attitude of young women towards young men, especially in the US, has made young women undateable in the eyes of young men, according to an opinion poll taken by Pew, P-E-W, Research Center in the US in 2022, which found that nearly 2/3, that's 63%, of young men between 18 and 30 don't even date young women. The fact that these young men don't even date such women is, of course, a demographic catastrophe. When 2/3 of young men in the US refuse to even date young women, that makes monoconscious feminism an extremely dangerous ideology that has to be countered, or we wipe ourselves out. Masculists, bi-conscious masculists, in brackets, bi-conscious equals being aware that gender oppression is a two-way street. That is, that women oppress men too, and in fact far worse, since many of women's gender crimes against men are horrible and last decades. For example, the big three that the Masculists keep harping on. That is, manslavery, divorce, rape, and forced fathering, making these gender crimes committed by women against men a lot more serious than the relatively minor ways that men oppress women that are so trumpeted by monoconscious feminists. Close brackets. To bi-conscious masculists, monoconscious feminists are extreme hypocrites, since women's gender crimes against men, e.g. the big three above, are so much more horrible that last decades, ruining millions of men's lives. So, what is to be done about all this? Masculists push for the FIPping of women and see this FIPping as vital to save humanity from wiping itself out due to the dating strike of young men. Masculist theorists are very conscious that the FIPping of women will go a long way in the liberation of men and will make a significant contribution to raising the birth rate. In many countries today, the birth rate, that is, the number of children born per woman, is well below the replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman. This situation cannot continue. So the Masculists, especially Masculist theorists and politicians, have a master plan to solve these major problems. This master plan involves the FIPping of women, the creation of a FIP Society, which by definition is the idea that girls are raised by parents and taught by teachers to be FIPs as adults, so that they are not fluffies as adults, who expect to manslave and divorce rape men, as happens so often in today's society. With all women FIPs, the divorce courts can be thoroughly reformed, basing them on the principle of financial independence of both divorcing parties. With all women as FIPs, this becomes practical. Alimony can be thrown out, so too with the halving of stuff and wealth. Custody of kids can be made joint by default, the way it is already in a quarter of states in the US and other countries, etc. Masculists want to see society be made bi-conscious, that is, be taught about masculist ideas, so that everyone sees that gender oppression is very much a two-way street, so that it will be a lot easier for GECs, it's GECs, that's Gender Equality Committees, to be set up in the parliaments that consist half of female feminist politicians and half of male masculist politicians, so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally, which is far from being the case in today's gynocentric world, gender politically speaking. The masculist half of these GECs will legislate the paternity rejection right. That will give men the same right to reject an unwanted pregnancy as women have with their maternity rejection right, aka abortion right, that allows women to block an unwanted pregnancy that could ruin their lives. In today's world, millions of women force undesired paternities onto men, thus force-fathering them, manslaving them for 2 decades to pay for a kid he never wanted in the first place, a major, horrible, decades-lasting gender crime of women against men.